Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amy McPhie Allebest. Here on Breaking Down Patriarchy, we have discussed many, many books, most of them nonfiction history texts or philosophical works that illuminate how patriarchy functions. We've also covered some classic works of fiction like The Yellow Wallpaper and The Awakening that highlight gender dynamics in women's lives. And we've discussed a few memoirs from inspiring leaders, though not very many. So listeners might be surprised to hear that the book we're discussing today is a memoir by a man and set in the world of chess. But let me tell you, this book is a fascinating look at patriarchal dynamics, in addition to being one of the best page turners I have read in years. The book is Dark Squares: How Chess Saved My Life, and the author is Danny Rensch, who is joining me in person today. Hi, Danny.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. This is going to be such a great conversation. I'm going to awkwardly read your professional bio out loud, and you just have to sit and listen.
Pretending we don't know each other, but yeah, let's do it.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's short, don't worry. Danny Rensch is an American... No, I'll start again. Danny Rensch is an American international master, world-class commentator, tournament organizer, co-founder, and chief chess officer of chess.com, and a chess celebrity. As a scholastic player, Rensch won multiple national championships and still holds the record for the youngest chess master in the state of Arizona. As an adult, he has essentially become the face of chess.com. And I will also add that Danny is on a very short list of best men that I have ever known. And you're like a brother to me and Eric, and we really, really love you. And so excited to talk about your book and so proud of you for this book.
Thank you. I don't know where to start or follow up that, but I'm so grateful to be here. You and I have talked about, I've talked about wanting to be on your podcast for a long time. And I don't know if I can just share that we almost started this conversation right when I was at the start of my book.
Yep.
And it didn't quite happen because at the time I sort of realized in the middle of the podcast, I was like, wait, I'm writing a book about this and I need to wait till we can really dive in so that I don't feel like I'm sort of half dipping my toe into trauma and not, or patriarchy or not, and really be able to kind of give the full story. And so this is the first time I'm talking about the book with anybody, and I can't think of a better person to do it with than you. And you and Eric are so special to me, but I'm honored to be here. I'm a little nervous. I want to say at the top that I can't wait to dive into things, and I'm glad I have an expert to walk me through a little bit, because I realized driving over here, I was like, I know the experience I lived, and I know the high control, high demand, and I know you're going to intro what the book is about in my family. I guess we'll get into it. But sometimes I feel like I don't even know the filters of what types of things were symptoms of patriarchy, and the types of, mechanisms that were in place for that versus things that were more generally a cult, and sort of, broader kind of systems that were in place. And I can't wait to talk about all of it and hopefully share in some ways something interesting about it. So,
oh, it'll be interesting.
yeah.
It will. And yeah, I mean, I've had similar experiences of like, wait, what was Mormonism? What's American culture?
Yeah.
What about that was like, it seemed like women had power, but below the surface, it's part of this structure. It's
Yeah.
complicated. It
Well, I feel
really
like
is.
I learned that from you. Like you hosted an event, and I remember the thing I took away. You shared a lot of things that night, and I learned a lot of things that I just didn't understand about patriarchy and about just kind of the systems and infrastructure we sort of live in and under and take for granted. But one of the ways you broke down, like, the part of what you grow up around is sort of, it's like the opposite of like privilege is blind, like the oppression is blind.
Yeah.
Like you build structures around, like you described it like in a road. Like if a road is blocked, you just go around. You don't always ask, why is the road blocked, right? Especially if you're used to the road has always been blocked, or hey, the buildings are stacked really close together because that's just what we do, and how we evolve and grow. And there are opportunities, or maybe things that happen in someone's life that give them moments to sort of assess things from a 30,000 foot view. And one of the things that you explained that night about patriarchy systems that are sort of taken for granted, and we don't even realize the daily ways it affects our life, it actually helped me in some of the process of writing my book. I don't know if I've ever told you that, because I was like, some of the things that you review about your life in that process are the things you knew you were going to write about, the things you thought you might write about, and then the things where you go like, I didn't even know that this was a thing until I took the opportunity to do this and was going through the process of doing it. And that I often thought back about that conversation. So
Wow.
anyway,
I'm honored.
yeah.
That's so great.
Yeah,
Oh.
but that was fun. I never told you that. There you go. I don't know.
Yeah.
Random story. I didn't even remember till now, but here we
Yeah.
go.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, let's get into it the way we always start
Okay.
podcast episodes, which
Okay.
is tell us the basics, like where
Yeah.
you're from, kind of maybe set the lay of the land, and then we'll dive into the subject of the book.
Okay. So, my name is Danny. Hi. I'm from Mesa, Arizona originally, uh, which at the time, Mesa, Arizona was home to what I grew up referring to as the family or the collective. This was a group um, that was formed under the auspices of a shared spiritual belief. I wouldn't call it a religion, but at the core of it, the foundation of it was that there was a trans medium named Trina Camp. She was sort of the guru or the deity, and in many ways um, presented as the boss. In some ways, though, I would say that it was much more of a patriarchy, not a matriarchy. Although it doesn't necessarily matter. I guess I'll be educated by you in terms of what it really was. But I will say that Trina Camp and her husband were the founding members of the collective, which was for or an extension of the Church of Immortal Consciousness. Um, and my parents joined the collective before I was born. So I was born in the group. I was actually born in a house at 920 East 7th Street. So shout out if you're living there. Sorry if that's awkward. That is my place of birth. It was one of several collective houses on what we refer to as the block.
Mm-hmm.
Several houses in East 7th Street. But at some point, the collective relocated to Tonto Village, which is a very small suburb northeast of Payson. Um, that is where I was raised, and basically from the age of 5 on, spent my years. And I guess part of me would ask, make sure if there's anything you think I'm missing, and let me know because you've read the book as well. But I would say that the collective at its peak was about 300 people, and I still refer to it, and will probably never stop going in and out of referring to it as the collective, as well as I would say correctly labeling it as a cult. With the
Mm-hmm.
time I've spent reviewing my life and assessing and being honest about what it was and what went down, and I would say most importantly kind of the scars and impressions that it left on the people's lives, that there were undeniable dynamics that it was a cult, a high control, high demand group with all types of things going on that were not okay, and we're going to get into a lot of those things today. But I want to share quickly that because I think some people might wonder why I struggle with that, and I think one of the things to say is, for many years growing up in the collective, we were educated as to what cults really were. You think of things like Jonestown, you think of things like Heaven's Gate or Waco, and we were indoctrinated to recognize the differences between a group that had an agenda, had
Mm-hmm.
an end game, if you will, very sad end games like mass suicide or others, right? And that had violent endings. Whereas the one thing that definitely was different about our group is there were no guns, there was no like violent agenda, and there was no broader sort of like goal other than some of the spiritual goals and some of the idea that they were doing something that was special and unique, which led to a lot of very bad things. Not having a goal didn't mean that there weren't a lot of things that
Yeah.
happened that weren't okay. But I think one of the things I like to share right away as I'm talking about this, this is the first time I've ever done this after the book, is that it takes a long time, I think, to be just honest with yourself, about what you experienced um, and about your own experiences within that group to even be able to actually tell yourself what it is. So I tend to go in, and I think I've forever had a label of I don't want to call it a cult, because if I say that to people, they'll go, you either use it too flippantly and people go, oh, you're just angry,
Mm-hmm.
or they make the association, oh, well, what was the Kool-Aid, what were we all drinking, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know why I wanted to say that off the top, but it was
No.
it was a cult that I grew up in. My parents were not founding members, but very early adopters. I was born into it along with a lot of people in my generation. My dad was essentially the number two in the cult, behind Stephen Camp, who's the husband of Trina Camp, and it was based on the hierarchy of Trina Camp being the spiritual deity, and things kind of fell from there.
Yeah. Okay, really quick before I forget, you mentioned the word trans medium.
Yes.
Can you just define that word?
Yeah. So trance is something that, for anyone who's ever visited a psychic or a channeler, there are people who claim to have the ability to receive information or in some ways be open to, whether it's messages from past loved ones or in some ways a higher level of consciousness and divine, that people who are psychic and or channel would say that they're passing on messages.
Okay.
But the difference between channeling or being a psychic and in a trance medium is that someone who goes into a trance is essentially leaving their body to allow for a spiritual being to take over and to speak through them.
Mm-hmm.
And so a medium, I think there's all kinds of mediums out there, right? But this type of phenomena mediumship that Trina Camp claimed and practiced was that she was completely not present to the experience, and that the spirit who spoke through her, who was Dr. Duran, who was a 15th century doctor, that was his. He is the one who was delivering sort of the teaching and the messages, and that was in many ways our church. Trance happened pretty much every Sunday. There were people who would have private trances, who would Trina would transfer them. But on as far as the only, like, if you were say we had a denomination that we regularly visited and had a ritual practice, it was that trances would happen on a community level every Sunday, and people would go, and sometimes Duran would give a sermon, other times there would be conversation, sometimes it was more wild and crazy than other times. Sometimes it was inspiring and an interesting, lesson to take away. But that was the practice of the group.
So it was almost like Dr. Duran was the leader through Trina.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Kind of.
Yes. Although in many ways, and I think, and I share a lot about this in my book, and I'm glad I get to talk about it. For a while I've been saying I should talk about this in the book, and then I can't talk about it. But I'm not saying that for any, not even to self. I'm saying, like, we're going to talk about it, but I talk about this in my book, which is that there are a lot of interesting lines that are crossed and or confused when a spirit is speaking to a person, right? Especially when that person's behavior and that person's, just general actions may not always be great. And you're trying to both separate your relationship with your faith, with your sort of translation or justification with like hypocrisy and cruelty. And I think a lot of people who went through this experience, without speaking for them, but knowing I've had a lot of conversation, I think a lot of people have really struggled with their own experience of, was there a baby in the bathwater? Was there something good in there? If so, what was that? And maybe sometimes you make a list of, well, these things were good about what we practiced, even if I fundamentally reject these cruel hypocrisies. But maybe sometimes when you start to review it, things start to shift in the list, and something you thought that was good, with more context and perspective, you realize, as you put it, the buildings were really close together because we were just building on patriarchy, right? And sorry, I don't know why I just love that metaphor you made. I'm sorry. So anyone hasn't seen that lecture by Amy, it's amazing. And so I think I've done a lot of my own process with that, but I'm just directly addressing that. I think that was one of the most confusing things growing up as a kid, especially because skepticism was pretty aggressively scorned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in very manipulative ways at times, where, you sort of realize you're questioning your own self-worth and you didn't even know you were being tricked into doing it because you are doubting something about it. But you also, in some ways, did have experiences where, like, the entity of Duran felt different than Trina, and she was not okay. She was a person, and had many good attributes to her, but there were a lot of bad things too. And I think that, you know, translating that and coming to terms with that experience is probably something I will be doing for the rest of my life. And I don't pretend to have any of that figured out, but it's definitely um, part of something that I share as totally openly, but I share my best perspective about it in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're in good company. I mean, especially among the listenership of this podcast, a lot of people coming from high demand religion. So this will be something that very much people can relate to, right? Parsing that out,
Yeah.
and for the rest of your life going, what was the baby and what was the bathwater, and what was really me and what was indoctrination. So it's hard. It's hard. And it's good to have people to be able to be on that journey with. So yeah. To start us off, a little bit deeper, since we're highlighting kind of the patriarchy in the book. And by the way, for listeners, the book isn't about patriarchy at all. Like, the book is about your life experience growing up in the collective and chess. But there were so many gendered themes in there, like you said, and we've been talking about this for years. So let's talk specifically about the dynamics between your parents and then your dad and Marlo, which is his wife after your mom, right? Because I think that kind of can be a way in to start exploring some of the gender dynamics that you witnessed growing up.
Yeah. So my parents were Steve and Debbie. Those are their names. And like I said, they were early members of the collective. And I'll spare their life story, but just to say that they came to the collective married. But one of the dynamics and sort of teachings or theories about this particular spiritual belief or group was that everybody has what it was called a like vibration. We're going to call it a soulmate for just to make it quick in terms of people's understanding of it. But the idea is that someone who you are on the same vibration with on every level, and together you are moving toward God, moving toward your highest self, moving toward your highest purpose, which in many ways can be thought of as not a bad thing, to think you have a soulmate and to have a partner to work things through. And if done appropriately, someone to reflect and help you grow in all the ways that we all work hard to make our marriages work, right? And so you can get it. But through the larger dynamic, which was that if you weren't with your like vibration, if you weren't with the right person, that you couldn't reach God, that you're sort of out of the kingdom of heaven. And that even more thoroughly, people, men and women, were both evaluated as to whether they were providing enough value to be in a like vibration relationship. But specifically, women were put into the lane of, because it was projected and sort of presented as a feminine-based teaching, which was a term used a lot, partly because Trina Camp was the quote-unquote leader, and she was a woman, but through whatever other reasons for that, and I can get into what I understand to be the best history of it, women were held to the standard of they are the spiritual voice to God. So this is different, I think, than a lot of mainstream religion, in that, like, if there's like men who have a relationship with God or they can hear from God, women were supposed to be the connection to and the direct way for a man to experience God and to sort of lead their marriage to enlightenment, if you will. And while growing up, that actually helped us think that we were special and different, because a lot of male dominance and patriarchy in other religions was actually pointed out to us. And we actually saw what we thought were bad things about a lot of other religion, because we were a feminine based teaching, and that the spiritual voice came from the woman in the marriage. But in reality, what this actually meant in practice was that women were held to almost impossible standards in terms of the expectations to keep the marriage together. And the men were given sort of free rein to believe that if the woman wasn't up to snuff, it was time to go shopping. And so, like, what happened in the relationship with my mom and dad was that after a few years, whatever cracks they may have already had in their marriage, because every one of them has them, I think I joke, so I'll say the line I said in the book, that in many ways people came to the collective under the idea that it was going to save their marriage, when in reality it was a fast track to a divorce. And I think that was true for what I observed a lot, and certainly it was true for my parents. And so before I was born, my dad had already slept with other women in the collective under this sort of like justification of being on a spiritual journey, of whether other women were his like vibration. And their marriage was basically completely falling apart because my mom was not up to snuff and being judged and processed. We'll get into the term process here, because that was the group kind of dynamic of what people did when they got together and talked at a meeting, and being processed and labeled as not being good enough for my dad. And so my dad simultaneously demanded that my mom get pregnant, which, again, their stories were always weird, because I think once I was born, my mom was like, no, like, I loved you. I always wanted a kid. And I was worried I had waited too long. So in some ways, my mom, and I think my mom's version was true, she was like, yeah, your dad was the trigger because of his like dominance and because he was like forcing this. But the only reason I was like so scared is I thought I was already too old. She didn't have me till she was 37, which was much older than a lot of people in the collective. And so whatever the truth is, I was born, and it didn't matter, because 6 weeks later, my dad left my mom to marry the oldest daughter of Stephen and Trina Camp, who at the time was 19 years old, and her name was Marlo. My dad was 38. And so to put like a spotlight on that dynamic, you have like a system where the men are under the auspices of it being a feminine based teaching to find their spiritual voice. Spiritual voice was actually a term used to find their spiritual voice. So even though the women were the spiritual voice, the system allowed men to have free reign. Women, even if they had kids, were left behind. There were many men who followed suit of my father. He wasn't the only one who did this. My dad was one of the only ones who married a much younger woman who also happened to be the oldest daughter of Stephen and Trina Camp, which with time, has become more and more clear as something that was presented as this like massive spiritual moment and movement for my dad. When I would learn later that in many ways, Trina Camp actually forced my dad to be with Marlo because she was drunk one night in a process. And that's actually not in my book,
No, I was
but I'm sharing it here for the first time. So there's like, you just sort of got the reality that there was like, it was in my view, and again, always correct me if I'm wrong throughout this process, if I label something a patriarchy, I'm not, but it was like a patriarchy posing as a matriarchy. And had a lot of levers or boxes that would allow you to check that the women were being put in a different spot or on a non-traditional pedestal. But in reality, the men were essentially allowed to act in many ways cruel and without really accountability to making their marriage work, because there was always an outcard that, you're just not my like vibration. You're not good enough for me spiritually. I need to find someone else. And that's kind of the PG version of what I just laid out, and that was the quickest way to describe, what I was born into. And so, and I'll wrap a very quick ribbon on it because I think I touch on it here, but then when I was born, because my mom was sort of scarlet lettered and kind of pushed aside in many ways, way down the totem pole, because that was a phrase that we use in the collective. It's like where they would literally have people describe, where do you think you rank on the totem pole? And they would have people rank, in open groups with others, and there would be fights about this stuff. It was a very the idea of calling out unspoken competition and jealousies and things that exist in humans became an all-out free-for-all of like violent expression, and it wasn't good. But my mom ended up getting sick, and so my dad was gone, and I ended up being passed around to like a lot of different women as a baby, to kind of like wet nurse. I had different wet nurses, and like two of the women ended up being like women that also had babies by my dad. One of them being Marlo, and then one of them being another woman that my dad was with. And so that just kind of frames a little bit of like, came into a bit of a wild situation.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry, maybe I don't know, that's too much to start.
No,
but we're
it's
diving
definitely
right in. So
we're diving right in.
I've got my pillow to hold on to, so everything's going to be okay.
I think I need a pillow.
When the anxiety hits, if you need a pillow, let me know.
I might need a pillow. No, I remember you telling us that story on a run one time. You were talking about being nursed, and just the fact that all of them were lactating because your dad had impregnated all of them around the same time, and just the trauma of. Whew, that's heavy, Danny.
And there was a lot of promiscuity. I mean, and there was also promiscuity by the women, but it was mostly the men. I think everyone was playing the game of finding the right spiritual mate, justifying things that were just not really okay, nor setting up a good example, which was ironic because it also was a teaching that projected and believed that the sins of the parents are cast upon the children, that patterns persist in families, and that any action you do, you will reap what you sow this lifetime or the next, which is a pretty high calling to commit to. And I don't think it's the worst thing to hold yourself to being as the best person you can. But when you're doing that and then acting this way, a lot of times the lack of self-reflection on what they were bringing their kids into sometimes like blows my mind when I think about it. So anyway,
it's crazy. I do have to say, I want to point out too, because you said like in terms of labeling things patriarchies and matriarchies, and we've talked about this before. There are so many examples of that, patriarchies kind of masquerading as women-centered, or maybe even using the word matriarchy. I can think of lots of religions that are that way. And even people will say like, oh, there's so many matriarchies. Like think of Queen Elizabeth in England. And it's ridiculous if you look at it, even just like one level under. She happened to be a woman, leader of a country, despite the fact that she was a woman, not because she was a woman, right? Structurally, completely a patriarchy, but with a female figurehead. And sometimes that does lead, as you said, to people to say like, to kind of I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. Sometimes that does lead people to be able to kind of erroneously point to something, right?
Yeah.
And like give an excuse.
It's a facade.
It's a totally.
Yeah. And no, I mean, there was a lot of that too. I think that, I mean, Stephen Camp and Steve Rensch, my father, they were the leaders of the collective, and the power dynamics ran through them on every possible operational level. So it's almost like you wouldn't even be able to say Trina Camp was the CEO and they were like co-COOs. It was like Camp was the CEO, my dad was the COO, and there was this like chairman of the board presented as the face of the collective.
Yep.
For in some ways the reasons that, and Stephen Camp often pointed to that, which is that because it was a feminine based teaching and that he was supporting his wife's purpose, because it was his wife's purpose that brought the collective together, which was to trance and to bring Duran's teaching to the world, almost as if that was a bit of a get out of jail free card, that other men who wanted to ever kind of challenge his sort of like dominance, or in some ways his like patriarchy, he was always able to sort of play both ends kind of against the middle there. And that was something that, you learn with time, you can kind of see it more clearly. And but when you're used to it, you're like, oh well, that's how it is. And I want to be with a wife who has her purpose, and because I want to be the most spiritual being possible, like him. And so I need to, and so the pressure was all around, because there was also a very traditional looking dynamic, because a lot of the women didn't have jobs because they were uneducated, pulled out of school, told to get pregnant, or given service industry jobs. So as far as like examples where patriarchy hurts both men and women, like it was like there were like expectations to be like a breadwinner and a performer in a way that like men weren't as encouraged to pursue things of like, if they wanted to pursue something that was a little bit less traditional in terms of being immediately, revenue driving, because the expectation was women are homemakers, a lot of them uneducated, a lot of them started having babies very young, and you have to provide in this way. But also, you'll never be as good in Stephen Camp because you all go out and make money, and my wife is the one who makes the money. So I've actually got it all figured out.
Oh.
And it was like an impossible dynamic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I would say that, and again, correct me if I'm ever wrong about the dynamics of patriarchy, matriarchy, or the system, but I've looked at it as the system was just unfair all around. I would actually say, and even though it wasn't my lived experience, because I was not born a woman, I did not grow up a young woman in the collective. I would say objectively, young women in the collective had it harder than young men, full stop. Even if my unique experience was kind of a wild one, as is chronicled, and I definitely went through some wild shit, if I can say that. But I think young women had it harder, and I think were set up in more ways that, in my opinion, just feel like it was impossible to overcome so many things that were going on. But I can see very clearly how the system of patriarchy was like, it was bad for everybody.
Yep. 100%.
And no one could really win fully, especially when at the middle was this impossible thing to compare yourself to, which was the woman's purpose was leading the collective, and the guy who's number one will always be more enlightened because her purpose comes first, even though he's really kind of running a business through the figurehead of his wife. Does that make sense?
So interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about how the women were. Most of them, I guess some of them were joining the collective, like in your parents' generation, and then some were being brought up in it, your generation, right? Tell me a little bit more about that lack of education and like what a girl and woman's life path was going to be in the collective.
Yeah. And as I jump into that, I'll say there was also an interesting middle generation, which was children who were moved somewhere, between the ages of 5 to early teens, right? And because there were people moving to the collective who had kids, right? And I only say that because the detail I think is interesting in terms of how people acted, how some of them rebelled earlier than others and left, whether in the night or otherwise, and felt like they needed to escape. But in regards to young women specifically, there wasn't really high expectations, which by itself is its own disadvantage on education.
Yep.
So because I think some women were the exception to the rule, which doesn't mean that it wasn't true, that some were encouraged to go to school based on, for whatever reason, they were recognized as being smarter, or, I don't know all the dynamics of everyone's family. Maybe some mothers and fathers fought harder, but overall the norm was, the expectation was to be a homemaker and to start a family young, and to um if anything, have a job in the service industry that helps contribute to household bills, which was generally the collective. It was a merged, 100% financially merged commune. And so when you already have that dynamic as far as what people see, right? And we've talked so much about representation based on the examples, it's justified and promoted as the right way. But even if you don't necessarily like it, it's all you kind of know anyway.
Mm.
When in reality, a lot of it was just that. And again, I'm not even saying this disparagingly, because everyone comes from their own background, but Trina didn't come from an educated background, right? And she was pulled out of school early, and she would say she was a cowgirl, and her sisters were, not necessarily, following that path. And so because the deity was like that, then everyone else should be like that, because that makes you the most spiritual. And Trina also started having kids young. So what I'm saying is, in some ways, like, I look at it now and see a very clear path of the sins of the parents were being cast upon the children. It's just the parents with the sins didn't realize they were the problem, right? And that they were creating this sort of infrastructure that the young women didn't have any other examples. So now they're on an uneducated, starved for opportunities path, and then being told very, very, very young that their value, their self-worth will be in a like vibration relationship, which is not just to bring a man to God, but to have babies and build a family. And, how that played out, probably in its most extreme, I would say maybe one of the biggest blunders the collective made in terms of practices that have a good idea. If you had a great soulmate who can help you work through your stuff and ultimately be a partner in you becoming the best version of a human being, but then telling 9 and 10-year-olds who their like vibration is, betrothing them, and then very early on, when they're in their very early teen years, pressuring them to have sex and or scorning them if they don't like their mate sexually. That's a serious problem. And this is probably one of the only, well, no, it's not. I mean, there are a lot of things I did not bring into my book for a couple of reasons. I think the most important one being that I made the commitment that this wasn't a cult expose, not because there didn't deserve to be an expose or stories told, but because that wasn't my reason for writing the book. I wanted to share a story, and my story, hopefully through some uplifting tales, but also not denying the struggle and the really, shit that happened. But then secondly, I really wasn't going to tell, regardless of it not being a broad cult expose, I wasn't there to tell stories that weren't my own.
Yeah.
And I hoped to, if I opened whatever door I could and provided a bit of a framework, where I've had a lot of people who, my friends, who the relationships I have maintained from the collective, who've had a little bit of chance to read it. They're like, oh my God, I'm so excited that your book can serve as like the first thing where I say, just read Danny's book and then I'll tell you my story, so that they're like, so I don't have to explain the teaching, the history, the like vibration, what happened with these. And I'm saying that because I really did hope that would help, because I think a lot of young women had stories very much like I just told you, which was that they were betrothed through the lens of like vibration against their will, or even if it wasn't against their will, they were so young to be able to say, your frontal lobe isn't developed. Like, how do you even know? Right. And like pressured into the relationships. Many of them, when they weren't going well, already had like very deep self-worth issues based around the fact that, oh, the boy I'm supposed to be with doesn't like me. And now they're on a spiral. And some of it was acted out in different ways with, behavior and drugs or whatever. And I don't want to get into everyone's story, but then there are those who submitted. And, a lot of young women have stories of feeling like they could literally feel the pressure of the collective in the bedroom with them the first time they were having sex. Like, that's like the level of where it was at. Right.
Yeah.
And other stories that are not mine to tell. And so I think I'm just on an extreme side. Like, that's probably some of the stuff that was acted out in a way that really is just not okay. And I would say worse than a lot of things that went down there.
Yeah. Yeah. And that whole concept of the girl or the woman being selected, like you're saying, in service to the man, right? Like
Mhm.
so you could see how that would be easy to confuse it, that she
Yeah.
was the one who had the higher status because she's being put on the pedestal, but it's the man putting her on the pedestal. He can yank her down from the pedestal anytime he
Yes.
wants. Your role is to be this person's path to God because he needs to get to God. So you're
Yeah.
just being
Oh,
used. So
and
it's very
directly. I mean, my wife would share many stories. There are stories in the book about our marriage, and we can get into any of those that you want. But I mean, my wife has her own long list of stories that didn't get in the book in terms of where she was judged, processed, scorned, directly told, and literally labeled for the downfall of my lack of chess performance in many
oh
cases, right?
gosh.
Um, and,
Tell.
and and at times even by me, right, based on my teaching and what I knew,
Yeah.
and that's, but yeah, no, the self worth and the shame, and then the stories when you have no outlet for like processing that in a healthy way, and like as a exact, I think what you said is exactly true. Like you were already being conditioned to believe that you were the keys to someone's ultimate enlightenment and success without even knowing how to be the keys, not
Yeah.
even knowing like that you wanted to be the keys, right? Or that the whole idea is kind of great. I don't know, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, I'll
No, that's great. Okay, I do want to hear more stories about Shauna,
yeah,
if she's okay with that, and if you're okay sharing
yeah,
some. But first, I do want to go back to the processing, and like you said, patriarchy harms men, and just the totem pole or the hierarchy and the comparing is one like classic sign of a patriarchy where like a few men at the top hold all the power and they oppress all the other men
mm-hmm,
for various reasons and all the women because they're women, right?
mm-hmm,
Like so that's just classic, that kind of and sometimes violent
mm-hmm,
oppression and like stratifying of all the people in the community. So
yeah,
can you, I guess I wondered if you could talk a little bit about processing, because that seems to me to be really integral to the way the
yeah,
hierarchy was maintained. Is
yeah.
that right?
No, it really was, and yeah. To take a step back, a process, as a noun, would be a group gathering of people within the collective to express to each other, to share
Okay.
their thoughts and feelings.
Okay.
Um,
Like a therapy session
like a
almost?
group therapy session without
Mhm.
any licensed therapists,
Okay.
and with people who were there in many ways to later use the very information you were
Yeah.
sharing against you. And because of awkward power dynamics, multiple relationships that have been with each other, and insert any other aspect of who was really in charge versus who was just kind of playing the game, like, and then dump alcohol all over everybody.
Oh
So like all
yeah.
that, and then like just dump alcohol on everyone, right? And so
Yeah.
and now and scene, right? And so I'm sorry I'm making
Oh.
light of it, but it's the first time I'm talking about it. I'm an entertainer at heart, so that's and scene, right? So here's the scene, and so um and yeah, so that was a process.
Mhm.
Now again, on the best of versions of nights, like, I think some people would share, and I would say that I experienced some processes that were not inherently all bad, and that with the right group of people, like, you could share vulnerably and be supported and loved, and people could even give an honest take on your life, and you could appreciate the feedback. And I think in the right group of friends, like, we all search for connection and truth and love, right? And the problem is that those were the exception that proved the rule, which was that it really wasn't like that because of
Mhm.
all the things that I said. And I'll say quickly before I describe even more specifics about the processes, because they were violent and they were very clear signs of, totem pole behavior, and how hierarchy was taught to kids at a very young age to then commit the same sins to each other. I will say that one of the things that I educated myself about and or became educated about was that this is actually a common theme across a lot of cults. And
Mhm.
I didn't know that. I didn't know. I mean, it's referred to differently, based on the cult, the terminology that used. I've heard the term the game, which was used, in there's the Sunshine Place, which is a podcast on Spotify that breaks this down. If anyone wants to check that out, I've heard of other types of groups where, again, similar word to process, but sometimes just called a meeting. But this sort of idea of the members of the cult sort of committing acts of cruelty to each other is a big part of the dynamic that keeps the group in check. And as I saw that theme, and as I said, became a little more educated on the fact that this was actually presented as something super special that made us different. And even though they were hard at times, ultimately they brought us closer and allowed us to evolve in ways that others weren't. In reality, what you had was when everyone is sort of doing the self-policing and the self-judging and the self-covert contracting, writing the unspoken expectations on each other and then monitoring whether they're delivered, and then either openly reporting to them, to the leaders of the collective behind their back, or even just rising in their own status because they might be more articulate than others or able to pound their chest more effectively in a different way. You sort of check a massive box of the group sort of controlling itself, because one of the things that I wrote about in my story that was very true for me, at least at observing our group, and I won't speak for members of other cults, but I will say that I feel very strongly that one of the only things that kept the group together for as long as it did was the processing, because not because you enjoyed it yourself, but because as you committed sins against others and as you expressed judgments and or were cruel and or acted in ways that were out of line, a lot of what happens in like addiction behaviors, you're not coming back because you enjoy it, you're coming back because it's comfortable and you don't know any better. And ultimately, to leave the group isn't just to come to terms with the fact that you no longer want to be abused, but that you also abused others.
Yeah.
And so when that became sort of clear to me and I saw, again, more examples of that, I think it was a bit more of an example that education really is the key to, I think, healing and solving all problems in life, because I can acknowledge that I had my own ignorance, right? And these days, even ignorance is a polarizing term, even though it just fundamentally means lack of education or
Yeah,
information about
sure.
something. I had my own lack of education and lack of information about a lot of other groups that probably kept me blind to the aspects of our group that were just a cult and that were just straight up not okay, and that actually had been done before, and that there was a system to this, and that it wasn't as mind-blowing as I thought, that I was coming to terms with this. And that is both like really hard to
Yeah.
acknowledge and also helps give you perspective. Um, and so yeah, I guess I would say that the process was that. And then but then you had your process, which was like your own sort of case, your own issues, and everyone kind of knew your process. Like Danny's process right now is just getting his ego out of the way so he can win chess games and whatever. Like, I'm just like making an example that a 12-year-old was told, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or and then to be processed was also like a verb or an adverb. Like you were going in to have a meeting with your partner, your spouse, and you were being processed by the ministers, right? So it was used in a very it was a term that was used broadly to describe that entire dynamic.
Yeah.
And yeah, even if there were very clear hierarchies within the process, often overseen by a minister. There were four ministers in total, which were Stephen and Trina, and then Steve, my dad, and Marlo, the very young woman my dad married. There were other ministers ordained over time, but those were like really the four core. Um, but similar to what we talked about earlier, that even if there was a woman dominating a process, it didn't change any aspect of the hierarchy and the ultimate sort of patriarchal system that was set up to consistently be compared and contrast, and frankly held to an impossible standard. But you played the game because you were holding other people to the same standard,
Yeah.
and you found your place based in that, and it was not great.
No, yeah. Okay. So next question, like the next big theme, and you're so brave, Danny, because I think this has to be super painful, but like there's the theme of like the fathers and literally patriarchy, like the rule of the father. You've already touched on that, but in terms of like your dad
Mm-hmm.
and the different father figures that you had growing up, I think there's a quote in the book that said, or maybe it's just kind of a concept, but that you needed to choose who your father was so that you would know who ran your life,
Mm-hmm.
basically,
Mm-hmm.
because your father kind of runs your
Yes.
life in this system. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Yeah. I'll say first that, yeah, probably the relationship that has been the hardest for me to navigate throughout the commitment to write a memoir has been the one with my dad, and for many reasons that people will read, and what I will say is it was both for the individual relationship of my dad and the trauma and the pain that was inflicted, but also I think more broadly because what he represented as a figure, both in like some of the early paths I was put on via the actions of like leaving my mother and literally putting in some ways us on a path of a mom with the scarlet letter and like the orphan bastard kid of Steve Rensch, and so I'm kind of just framing that. Thank you for saying that. This has been very hard. It is
Yeah.
hard to talk about with my dad in particular. We've done a lot of work to heal to the best level we can. But I think my dad's my dad's obsession to some degree with with my choice of him being a father or not in some ways is kind of weird because you're like, well, like if he really is your father, shouldn't he just know it? Like, why does he need you to choose it, right? But there's a larger thing to explain, which is that in the collective, kids were sort of told as they came into their own or asked to ask the question whether they thought their parents were their spiritual parents.
Yeah.
So in a similar sort of theory on everyone kind of polices each other and you create this impossible dynamic where really it's perfect because then Steven and Trina are the only parents you can really trust, both if you are an adult or a child.
Mm-hmm.
And that was set up. My dad was in many times challenged as to whether Stephen Camp was my real spiritual father or him. I also had a stepfather named Dennis who remarried my mom Debbie for many years when I was a kid before I was taken away from my mom, which is a big part of my life, and framed as my dad was my dad, even though he really wasn't my dad. And I'm giving a little bit of background, and I'm sorry for confusing
No.
anybody. But it's otherwise we will be here for hours, right? If you want to buckle up. But what I'll say is my dad had two things going. One, wanting to be more important and or at least as important as Stephen Camp, because Stephen Camp was the one obsessed with my chess. And so he was always abrasive in his challenge of whether I had chosen him as my father
Mm.
through the spiritual lens of is are you am I really your father? And it was a way for him to sort of like claim ownership over me as his son. In some ways, you could argue righteously so, a little bit based on his pain about how
Mm.
Stephen Camp had handled the dynamic and what he felt he wasn't able to do. And he and I have talked about that. But then back to the concept of the patriarchy, it in and of itself is its own indictment of the problem, which was that everybody in the collective to some degree was being told what their life was supposed to be to do either by Stephen Camp or Steve Rensch.
Mm.
And so regardless of the unique thing that he was my blood father, like all the young men and a lot of men would have their own stories of like their self-worth and their value being governed and run through whether Stephen Camp and Steve Rensch approved of your purpose, of your plan, of anything, right? And again, like so many horrible dynamics young women went through and some young women did have that same experience of like a direct sort of ordainment or non-ordainment. But I think one of the things that the young men went through in terms of that exact experience was like if you were being successful, you were being approved and sort of told that your purpose was on track. And like the moment you weren't, you were being like so many bad things were happening and being judged, being split up in your marriage, having your kids taken away from you or at least encouraged it, or in some ways just the thing that you loved no longer being an option. You're not allowed to do this anymore. And choosing the teacher was a big part of that. So my father was actually my father wrestling with this dynamic, and because of the power struggle he had with Stephen Camp, who was really acting as my father. But in many ways, this dynamic of like the children choose the parents and like the student chooses the teacher was flipped in so many ways that like you had to like throw yourself and prostrate yourself at the feet of Stephen and Steve. But if they didn't think you were being successful enough, they could rip it away from you at any time in the same way that like it's a feminine based teaching. They're the spiritual voice. But if the man isn't bearing the fruits of that, obviously it's a like vibration relationship. Well, then you're not his like vibration.
Yeah, blame the
Right.
woman.
And so, and it took me a long time. I mean, I deal with this all the time, and I will be in therapy about this probably for the rest of my life. But the relationship with my dad led to a lot of I've referred to it as, I always refer to it back as the war with the wrenches, and I hate using the term war, but I don't always know what else to describe it. But there was a literal time period where when I was coming to terms with just how cruel this was and trying to reheal my relationship with my mother, who I was taken away from. And then, 10 years later, now that I was allowed to speak to her again and working on that relationship, I literally I couldn't even deal with my father around the hypocrisy of how much pain and how much self-worth had been wrapped up in feeling like if I wasn't close to Stephen Camp and Steve Rensch, I wasn't close to God. And so from that perspective, it's like a very traditional like way you are set up to like experience that your church and your pastor and the priest is like they are. And so if you're not following, the doctrines, then you don't have a relationship with God, nor do you have any experience of what that is. And like it was so wrapped up into the power dynamic and their own power dynamic with each other that it was very hard. And I'm sorry if I bounced around a little bit. I think it wasn't even because I was not wanting to talk about anything. It's just it's a hard thing to talk about, um for both personal reasons and because it's a very difficult thing to just quickly explain.
No, yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking like talk about high demand. People talk about high demand religions, right? And high control environments. And just to validate Danny, like, because I grew up in a very high control, high demand environment myself. But you have layers there because there was a lot that was controlled and demanded in my environment, but never would it be like, and we're going to take your piano lessons away if you don't obey, or we're going to take away like things that were fundamental, or we'll take you away from your mother if you don't do the right thing. And I can only imagine the anxiety that would cause a kid.
Yeah, and then there were the direct, both spoken and unspoken messages that taking away your relationship with spirit and God. The threat was that if you're not on the right path, I mean, some religions use the term "you're going to hell."
Yeah.
But in this teaching, it was that you would have to re-embody, which a teaching that was based in the belief of reincarnation. You know, dogma is dogma regardless of the framing, because when it's used to oppress and control, it's not right.
Yeah.
And even if there are parts of reincarnation that are very different than, a single lifetime spiritual belief system, the threat of you are not on the right spiritual path to God, and then and it's being reflected in your life because clearly we see the evidence here. And so like, the only way to shake this up is to take you from your mother here or to break up your marriage there. And then, in addition to growing up in a very patriarchy household, and you and I have talked some about that, and like just there's the high demand and the high control and the stress of the patriarchy in the house. And then you're right, then it's like, then there's like the collective dynamic, and then the broader spoken message is also like, it's even more of a sin to know that you're in the highest teaching and leave it than it is to have never known it at all.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's like a common phrase. So like you had just a lot of like self-worth, shame, and so much stuff wrapped up, even in the idea that you might doubt it. Right. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again because it has been my experience. What I have learned through that and all the years of working on myself and just, healing, a traumatized brain, is that you learn that like abused kids don't stop loving their abusers. They stop loving themselves. And it takes a long time to learn to re-love yourself when you believed that you were the one who was wrong to ever be skeptical, or this bad thing happened because you were on the wrong path, or, and so it's a hard thing, I think, for people who did grow up in amazingly healthy homes, and thank you. And that's amazing. Right. But like, if you don't have that experience of being abused or being, put in that sort of dynamic, it's hard to totally understand at first or relate to, because you go like, well, then once you got older, like, why didn't you just leave, or this and that? So similar to the self-policing dynamic, you sort of self-police your own feelings, and you're building castles and cathedrals around these different parts of your feelings, to protect yourself from the truth, because that's what an abused kid does in order to survive their environment. Because it's a lot safer to believe that you're the problem than it is to believe that the person who is providing for your health and safety and well-being is the problem. And when you multiply that by a broader collective and you realize it's the same for many of the parents, it has given me the compassion and forgiveness for my mother in many ways because of things that we went through. And of course, I want to talk about my relationship with my mother and how that rolled into my relationship with Shauna. But I would say that I kind of learned that dynamic of abused children don't stop loving the abuser, they stop loving themselves, also can apply to abused adults.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they look like an adult, emotionally immature people find their gurus for a reason. And I'm not saying that everyone who joined the collective was by definition an emotionally immature, stunted person, but maybe I am saying that that was definitely the rule, right? And so if you're looking for someone to provide a path and provide the answers for you, and you sort of enter into that covert contract, and then you are abused and you develop skepticism about your faith and about your church or about your leaders, it's a lot easier when you never dealt with the reasons you were there to begin with, or your traumas or your pain, the things that put you on this emotionally immature, path. It's a lot easier to kind of self-police yourself than it is to question and doubt,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that's how the parents were able to do what they did to the kids, and the kids were able to do what they did in their life, and everything survived for as long as it did. Because Stephen and Trina were the parents. It was never Neverland. No one was ever growing up, and the system kind of ran itself.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, talk about your mom and Shauna.
Okay.
Start wherever you want. You can
Yeah.
talk about your relationship with your mom, and then I
um,
do want to talk about what Shauna endured too
yeah.
when she joined the collective.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the dynamics of the collective and the patriarchy that it was. And my mom, early member of the collective, was a part of the system and a devoted member, to all the best of her abilities. What I would say, and the story that I share is that my relationship with my mom in hindsight was always kind of set up to at some point be fractured based on how people talked about her, how I saw her as the scarlet lettered woman, how I was sort of positioned very early on to see her place in the totem pole, at the bottom or near of it. Um, and and so you're already developing your relationship of how you evaluate your mom, and then I would say that probably you develop all your early framings of women through your first relationship with the most important woman in your life, which is your mother. And so, seeing a lot of that stuff was very hard, even if I didn't know it was hard. But then, as I share in my story, as I got really good at chess as a man who, a young boy, but as a man who also now had a purpose as ordained with chess that was excelling very rapidly, and I was becoming one of the best players in the country, I quickly became higher on the totem pole than even my own mother and even my own stepfather, who was, as you described earlier, there's like the alpha males and there's a lot of beta males that are sort of kept in within the caste system of their place on the totem pole. And so at some point my relationship with my mom and Dennis just my stepfather completely fell apart because I was conditioned to believe that I was better than them.
Hmm.
And they were simultaneously being conditioned to believe that if they allowed me to kind of remain in their household, that their marriage would fall apart because I was sort of superseding them spiritually. And again, this is super fucking wild to talk about what I talk about, but I would say that, the relationship with my mom has been the biggest I've never talked about it yet, so I might cry a little bit. We'll see how that happens on the podcast, but that's okay.
I've cried lots of
It has
times
been
too.
the biggest lesson of my life, the biggest, simultaneously the biggest like healing and some of the biggest regrets. And so when you're a 12-year-old kid who tells your mother that you think you need a new spiritual parent, and you mean it and you believe it, and you've been conditioned and brainwashed to believe it, and then you don't see your mother for 10 years and you lose that relationship, and then with some weird bumps along the way that people will read about where we had interactions that, if anything, made it worse.
Mm.
And then my mother, after a few years of healing with my mother, and I'm sparing you some of the life story because it is a podcast. My mom then died very young of a massive stroke, and so then I lost her very quickly. And so when you work so hard to change your relationship with someone, because of what you've been through, and then you lose them very quickly, it definitely gives you a sense of perspective and gratitude, along with the flip side of gratitude is you have to learn, better make grief your best friend, because that's how you learn how to deal with it. So my relationship with my mother was it is a traumatizing relationship. And for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, I'm sorry, but it doesn't have a happy ending in that regard to my relationship with my mom. And yeah, there's a lot more to that in terms of, how I learned to forgive myself. I was a kid for everything that happened. I've also learned to forgive her because I was also very angry that she allowed me to be taken away, that she was a participant in the broader, not just patriarchy, the broader cult, the entire system. um but obviously, as I also share, there's the fact that we had the time we did and healed to the level we did, and as I've educated myself and gained the perspective I do about what she was going through, like I consider her the strongest person I've ever known. And uh my book is dedicated to her for a reason. So but yeah, and then the best part about my wife is that, and we'll talk about everything she went through, or whatever we can. She's gone through a lot more than is both in my book, or that I could tell, or that I wouldn't be my place to tell. But my wife never felt that way about my mother, which is very revealing, because she had every reason to, and could have easily hopped on so many bandwagons about Debbie Sampson. That was what's funny about saying the term Debbie Sampson. So my mother was Deborah Rensch, at some point married to my father, then Debbie Gordon. But in the collective, when you referred to like a single woman in a way where you were sort of shaming them, you always referred to them by their maiden name. So like Debbie Sampson was like, when you said Debbie Sampson, it was like, this is a Debbie Sampson energy,
Oh my goodness.
was like a thing that meant something. It carried a charge behind it. I don't even explain that in the book. But yeah. So
wow.
Debbie Sampson, my mother, my at one point my name was also Sampson. Multiple name changes throughout the wild process, but my wife never saw Debbie Sampson. She saw Debbie, Danny's mom, and she loved my mom, and always thought that it was a bit fucked up that when she poked and prodded at my pain of my mom, because I had participated in all of this as a child, and basically, if you want to call it, self-taken, self-kidnapped. I had self abducted and been taken and removed myself. It's a very complicated thing.
You weren't.
But my mom never, I mean, my wife never saw my mom that way. And she
Mm.
was immediately pushing for healing, up against what was at my worst, rage and anger and abusive behavior toward my wife, because I was a very wounded person who was wounding those around me if they were brave enough to poke the bear and stick around. And so as my wife was brave enough to poke the bear and stick around, and we were fighting for our lives in our young marriage, she never let me get away with not having a healed relationship with my mom, which of course I'm now eternally grateful for. One of the other things that makes my wife very smart and strong and ahead of me in so many ways. And so, and she knew that it was the right thing to do, not just for me, I think also for our family and for our kids. And I think she loved my mom too, and wanted, she just didn't agree with what was going on. So yeah, and when it comes to Shauna, do you want me to talk about that, or do you want to ask any questions? I can keep going talking about Shauna.
Just keep going.
Okay. Um, I love breaking the fourth wall. I hope everyone sees all this conversation.
We can.
It's good. It's good. But yeah. So my wife's name is Shauna. Obviously, mentioned her a few times, and we met very young because she was in the collective as a young girl, and her mother, Kathy Carries, to use her maiden name, because that's what you do when you're scorning single women. I'm joking, but Catherine Carries. It was Kathy Carries, married to Rick Galloway, and Rick Galloway left Kathy and married the second oldest daughter of Stephen and Trina Camp. And Kathy did not stick around in the collective when that happened. She left to Chicago, and as was shared, was that she was afraid if she stayed in the collective that one day her kids might be taken from her, which is pretty damn ironic, right? That's why the story writes itself, because then years later, as young little Danny from the cult in Arizona, the child chess prodigy, started traveling the world, we were looking for families to host us. And Shauna's family had maintained, Kathy and my mom had maintained some relationship which in hindsight was amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who left the collective, I would say there were less clean breaks than you would think. Plus, Rick was still in the collective, the father of Kathy's 4 children, even if he had left her for a younger woman and started a new family. So there was a thread to kind of reconnect and say, hey, you're in Chicago. Danny needs to play the Chicago Open and the U.S. Masters every year. So I started staying with them and got to know Shauna again when I was 13. She was 15, and we, lived our separate lives. But then when I was 16 and she was 18, she graduated high school. Her family moved back to Arizona. And there is a very long story to that is not totally mine to say, but I'll say that Kathy had remarried and was not in a good relationship. And because you might ask, why would someone ever move back to the collective? And that's the kind of thing that you do when maybe you don't have any other option. And for me and Shauna's sake, we liked each other and we basically started dating when I was 17 and she was 19. And because we had been dating for a month, we then moved in together because that's what you have to do. We were forced to move in together, which we were okay with at the time.
Yeah.
Because starting a like vibration relationship was like the most important thing. It's like, oh, okay, so we're being ordained, we get to be together, then great, right? But after the honeymoon period wore off, which is a couple of years of being teens and not caring so much about collective power dynamics and just going with the flow, um, we had our first kid. Shauna was pregnant when I was 19. She was 21. Nash, our oldest son, was born just after I was turned 20. And yeah, our marriage, in many ways almost fell apart in its first few years because of both the broader collective dynamics and the pressure on us and constant performance reviews for Shauna if she
Mm-hmm.
wasn't up to snuff, for golden chess child prodigy Danny, who even in my late teens, early 20s my life was still being run by Stephen Camp and Steve Rensch. So performance review and whether it was up to snuff, but then also my own wounded and at times cruel behavior because I was abusing alcohol, I was abusing opioids, things that she didn't know. And whenever she was brave enough to poke the bear, I was abusive to her in verbally, never physically, never. But I'd be open about that stuff, and I try not to qualify it, not because I'm trying to grandstand or in any way like diminish
No.
relationships with actual domestic violence, but because I'm trying to be honest and share my shortcomings as the only way I know how to do to really fully to embrace this process, which is that I was an asshole and I was a young guy who had very little respect for women, if any. My mother had left me from my view at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I probably didn't have a great relationship with her to begin with because of the other things I explained. If I'm really processing the way I saw the world, I had different examples given to me by the patriarchy figures, and my wife was evaluated consistently under the microscope of whether she was doing enough for me, and I felt justified about that. And so, in addition to having a lot of pain and trauma and wounds that was being dealt with via substance abuse, in addition to having a lot of structural support for that type of behavior, I personally also had a lot of misogyny in me. And I think it's a big word to use because I think there are different levels of misogyny. But fundamentally, as far as I know the definition, it is a lack of respect for women. And I think I carried a lot of that. And I think there's a lot of that in our world, and I don't want to hop on a soapbox unnecessarily. I think a lot of young men carry more subconscious, unspoken misogyny than they realize, and it doesn't make them bad. It's just something that, in my opinion, is in some ways part of how men are taught very early on to objectify women, not just physically and sexually, but in terms of their value brought to the world and society in a way that I have, processed in myself a lot through the pain of almost losing my marriage and almost divorcing and also losing my mother and a lot of things that have, taught me some of these lessons. And now I have 2 daughters that are, the loves of my life. And I want more than anything to make the most possible change for them. So, but the truth is, yeah, I think I brought in a lot of pain. Hurt people. I brought in a lot of perspective that wasn't right, even if it was, and that's where people struggle with perspectives that aren't right because you have pain that is right. You have heartache,
Yep.
and your feelings are real. And as my mom, took responsibility for it in every possible way, and even in ways that she probably didn't even have to, but she did anyway because she understood that healing was the most important thing. I was a hurt kid. I was an orphaned kid, and it was like, and I blamed my mom, and then I took a lot of like anger and rage and just heartache into my life on a daily basis, even if I was covering it up. And so I think as you process your feelings and you recognize your perspective is not right, that's a thing that a lot of people struggle with, right? Because you have righteous anger, but it doesn't mean that your actions are justified.
Yeah.
And it's easy to deny one and in the facade of the other. But I think I did a lot of work in that regard. I continue to, and by no means am I a perfect husband or father, but I think we've come a long way. And um yeah, and I share very openly about my marriage and all of this stuff in the book. This isn't breaking news here because I wanted to, in addition to the things I said, I wasn't doing a called expose. I was telling my story. I wasn't going to tell the story of others because I didn't feel like it was my place, but I was going to be a partner in any way I could to open the door and provide that platform. But I was also not doing this with a machine gun of anger or blame. In fact, I already have had people who've read it who feel like in some ways I was too soft and too hard but that's their experience doesn't have to be mine in terms of it. But I did say from the beginning I was doing this to share as much of anything else my overcomings and what I said I believed other people did, which is wound people and then struggle to come to terms with it. I was also a part of that. And I think it's healthy to do that, not because we all need to self, flagellate or hurt ourselves, whatever. But like, I think it's important to be honest about our contribution to the broader systems. One, because I think it gives us integrity, and I would argue it makes it easier for people to hear you when you do have an opinion because you're not running away from your own faults. But also, I feel like it's a little bit easier to understand when I go like, yeah, actually, like I don't judge myself for this, even if I regret it. Just like I can say, I have very clear understanding and I have come to forgiveness, but that doesn't mean I make excuses for my abusers, right? Like learning to kind of operate is what I've tried to do in that space with my marriage and with what I brought in there. And I'm probably going on too long, but I hope my stories were okay
Yeah.
for the podcast.
No, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Danny. Yeah. I have to say a lot of the points in the book that you just described were the ones that made me cry. And like were so touching. And it's clear you have done like heroic work in processing everything for yourself, but then healing your marriage, being the like stable father that you are in your family. It's just I just admire you so much, Danny. And I was with Eric a lot when he was reading the book too, and he cried over and over again, just with love for you and how everything you went through, and then how you've been able to metabolize things and just alchemize these really painful experiences into such wisdom and such goodness in changing the trajectory of life. Not very many people can do that. So
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, one last topic. You are the face of chess in the world in many ways. We haven't even talked about chess that much yet. You mentioned chess, but I did want to ask you about kind of some of the gender dynamics in chess, in your experience in chess, and then maybe if we have a minute, more broadly in the chess world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my experience from a young age was definitely immediately noticing the problems of lack of women playing chess, but specifically in regards to the collective, I mean, the chess team that Stephen Camp built wasn't allowed to have girls.
Wow.
And he kind of made that decision early on that chess wasn't for girls. And and there were some girls who would have probably loved to play chess. And again, I look at it and I realized at the time I didn't know any better or judge. I was like, okay, well, this is the decision that's been made. So I certainly spent my years traveling with the boys on the chess team. We talk about the Shelby School chess team, which was all boys, and it was always the Shelby boys, the Shelby boys. But the truth is, even if I wanted to make excuses and say it was like an aspect of the times or there weren't as many girls playing chess, the truth is when we traveled, there were more girls on other chess teams. So that didn't necessarily have to be the case. And I think it's another unfortunate kind of like check mark in the list of what I would say was like the lack of opportunities for women in the collective. And that makes me sad. And that's something they dealt with. And in addition to a lot of other hard things as well. And so, yeah, my personal experience was that girls were not promoted, they were discouraged, and they were prevented from playing chess. As the years went on, there were some other girls that got on the chess team when it was less about that core group of boys who were a part of a kind of his spiritual mission,
Mhm.
going out into the world to spread the gospel of the teaching. But yeah, so that was an unfortunate experience that I think with time I saw even more clearly that wow, like that was not okay. And more broadly, I think in regards to my position at chess.com and how I view the gender imbalance in
Mhm.
chess and kind of what we're trying to do about it. When I say we, I speak for myself and Eric, and just in terms of how we view it, it remains a big problem, and I definitely can't speak to it as my lived experience, obviously. But I have done the best I can for my own edification with many of the most influential women in chess, both from top players to others. And I know that there are a lot of like very big uphill battles that they still feel that aren't being talked about. And so if I was to break them down quickly, the ones that even aren't, I would say that one thing I've become even more educated about, which I think is really interesting through the lens of patriarchy, is that I was talking with Anna Cramling recently and her mom, Pia Cramling. Pia, who's one of the most celebrated women in the history of the game, one of the most celebrated chess players in the history of the game, period, women or not. And Anna, who is one of the most probably well known faces of the game. We were talking about two things that I put on like a new hat of mine, and I've been stewing this over where we can make more of a difference. One was even more clarity on lack of safety
Mhm.
when you're in a male dominant field, and the privilege bias that happens from, even if you were not a bad actor, the ability for a bad actor to hide amongst the majority
Mm.
when you have infrastructure that doesn't call to task. And if you were a minority, specifically a woman in that environment, that many women still don't feel as safe and over the board chess as like men would take for granted. And that was actually, without even getting into all the stories, because not all of them were in our conversation, the one that we recorded for the podcast, that was really upsetting. And I think that there's so much more to be done. And that led to me talking a little bit about the infrastructure overall, because we think of women players and we can debate and talk about how to create more opportunities for women as chess professionals. Then we can talk about what I think chess.com has done a very good job of, and the generation that is my generation, we have worked hard to change what I would say is even the definition of a professional woman chess person, by creating spaces for creators and streamers, and
Mm.
helping with representation, not because everyone has to be the next Magnus Carlsen, but to first create the idea that you can even see someone in a high position who looks like you and acts like you. So in regards to helping change the label and the narrative and the expectation of what defines and what helps to bring representation to a top influential person in chess, I think there's been a lot of really great strides there. And I think there is a lot to discuss about the player dynamics, but it is different because there are still men and women, different separate tournaments. There's a debate about whether that should even be the case. And so I think those are helpful conversations. I think there's been some good work in terms of representation, regardless of whether they're a top player or not. But the lack of safety that people still
Yeah.
feel, and then I jump past the main thing that I learned in this that I feel very motivated about, which is that part of it is that all the people in charge are men.
Mm.
And that's like something that I think we forget, because we focus on the debate philosophically of men or women events. And we focus on what was previous lack of representation is still an imbalance. We still need more women in high profile positions as creators, commentators. But I'm even going to say for now, I think we're on a good path there. But when it came to this, and I had this startling moment of realizing the lack of arbiters, which in chess, an arbiter is like a referee or a tournament director, the lack of organizers,
Mm.
the lack of like club administrators, the lack of people creating the space where you would feel safe, not being women, was, I feel bad saying that it was a new light bulb because it was obvious
Mm.
when it was there, but it was
Yeah.
an interesting conversation for me
Yeah.
to go, like that is actually an even more important area maybe to invest in, not just for representation of women in those positions of power, but because the type of environment that a woman might create in that position might be something that feels differently or safer, right? So
Yeah.
and I'm sharing that this is a very new story for me, but I thought that was actually, it was both upsetting, but it kind of made me excited because it gave me a little bit of a new North Star. And I like having those because I feel motivated to make a difference in that area in a way that maybe I wasn't thinking about before. But to end on that, I would say I think the chess world has historical problems that are unfortunate because it's hard to make a macro difference when you've inherited the sins of the fathers, for lack of a better way to put it, right? So
Yep.
you've inherited a bit of the sins of the previous generations. You're trying to make a macro difference in micro ways, and you know that, I think you and I have talked about, like, 50 years ago, it wasn't just chess. It was women still being actively discouraged from pursuing any fields in math or science or technology or whatever that was, right? And so you're fighting those fringe areas of chess. You're fighting culture in gaming and chess in general. Those are big topics that um, we basically try to remain aware of and do the best we can to make sure everyone knows that, as far as chess.com is concerned, chess is for everyone. And then, not just saying that as a blanket statement, but I like breaking it down into buckets so that we can make more macro waves in micro moments, because we're not blending the larger problem that is an undeniable problem into a big, well, I don't know what to F and do about this. But to try
Mhm.
to be specific and help areas that can really make an impact is kind of how my brain tackles it.
Mhm.
And so I think in some ways I feel encouraged, and that there are more women playing chess than ever, and that there are good things happening in a lot of representation regards, and then also discourage at times when I'm kind of like educated even further of like a blind spot that I had because
Yeah.
of my own, majority privilege in that way. And so anyway, but hopefully that helps. I think the chess world is doing pretty good in this particular lane.
Mhm.
And I'm hoping that years to come are not just safer, but just full of, more of the most influential and recognized figures being women. And I do believe we will have a women world champion at some day. And I think, we have to, unfortunately, I think, sometimes be patient with those things, and also, like, not avoid the hard conversations or make changes where we can along the way.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, you are making such a difference. And it is cool to see on a timeline, like you said, 50 years ago,
Yeah,
massive, dramatic improvements. And so just to imagine, and they're accelerating too. So it won't be the same amount of improvement from the last 50 years to the next.
yeah,
It'll be even,
yeah.
more rapid improvements. It is really exciting. And to your point, also, like you look at the other fields,
Hmm.
and it's chess is one of the ones that is the most behind,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
it is way behind. Like you see more women in many more women in medicine in
yeah.
all kinds of different fields. Chess is like
It's not.
lagging behind, but it's going to be, I have a feeling it's going to hit like an inflection point where it just takes
Yeah,
off. And you're really planting those seeds, like in girls, right? Like in children that are going to come up and be the
yeah.
next generation. It's going to be fun to watch it
I hope so,
happen.
and I do think so too. I appreciate
Yeah.
you saying that, because I worry about that, but I do think that this generation hopefully will be seen as one that did plant a lot of seeds, and
Yep.
the women doing the work, across the board, are leading the way, both in things that they're saying and doing, and also just by being examples
Yeah.
and being present to it. So I hope so too. I think there's more inflection points coming here.
Yeah. Okay, last question. Um, every episode in season 5 has ended with action items,
Mm,
like something that you could leave with listeners that could be a lesson that you've learned, but that could be applied, like kind of applicable in people's daily lives.
wow.
Am I springing this on you? Did I forget to
No,
put that
you,
in the
you did
outline?
spring it on me. I actually didn't know it was coming, but I love
Okay.
it. Um, let's see. I'll start philosophically, I guess, a little bit from my life experience, or what and why I shared the story I did. I think I really do believe that we are not defined by what happens to us, but by the stories we tell ourselves. And I think, in an actionable way, I think that we all have ways to make change, like, every day, in terms of, like, how we're perceiving anything. And I guess when I add that, I think if you perceive something wherever possible as it was the best possible thing that could have happened because it happened, the outcome, or the likeliness that you actually start to believe that and find ways to frame things because of the way you chose to look at it, because of your perspective, it can only be net positive for the world. And of course, it's really hard to believe that something as small as that could make a difference when we have so many big things going on. But at the same time, I think um, that that lesson, I guess, and the ones that have come from me, despite the fact that I was framing what felt like unjustifiable things through the lens of this was the best possible thing that could have happened. I guess I would just share that that's a big part of my story and what I believe is helpful. I would say actionably, I guess I'm staying philosophical to say that I think that real change comes when it kind of comes internally. It's a little bit back to what I was talking about in my marriage. I think that it's important to, not just be the change you want to see in the world, but if you're going to talk about things that you hope to make a difference, like doing it from the perspective of like full vulnerability and authenticity
Mm-hmm.
and honesty, like has to be the first goal. And I think it's very easy to be afraid to do that. And my hope is that if anyone has a thought that their demons are too much, or what, you know, the mistakes they've made are too much, I would hope that they would, one, take the proper steps to talk to someone in a way that could help reframe that, because I believe that everyone is good and we all have a child in us, born in a cult or not, that is there for all the good reasons. And I wanted to say that it took me so many years to learn that I was good because of the messages that I got, and then what happened because of that, and the self blame that I carried about things that brought me pain. That if I could bring any message to anybody, I would be like, hey, like start with being vulnerable and really authentic about who you are, what you've done, and what you carry, and let that be the loudest thing, before you I don't know, focus on anything else. That would be something
Mm-hmm.
I would say.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a to-do list here, so I would say last thing is people should play chess because it's good for them. And chess makes people smarter. Smarter people make the world a better place. But I will end on this and say that I actually really, one of the questions I was asked the last time I had a question sprung on me was, your book is titled Dark Squares: How Chess Saved My Life. How did
Mm.
chess save your life? And I went, oh shit, I don't even know. Like I don't even know that the title was my idea. So that's actually what happened. But then I thought about it, and I realized that what was happening for me in my life was that chess was tormentor in the way that it was this way that I was consistently evaluated through, not just personally, but then spiritually, and then taken from my mother, and then like my marriage could be split apart based on chess performance. And chess had brought this hardship, right? But chess had actually exposed me to
Mm.
so many other people, so many different types of cultures, so many different other ways of being and living, good and bad. And even though I didn't totally realize it at the time, but I was being educated, and I was becoming less ignorant about things that existed outside of this cult dynamic. And those muscles and skills ultimately were there for me when I needed them most,
Yeah.
to allow me not just to see the bad, but also, I would argue, and this is where there's different relationships. People who've left our church have their relationship with the church, where I would argue I was able to come to a healthier place, and or at least not let it affect my life in the hot stone of anger that we try to hold on to and hurt somebody else, but always hurts us more. And it was because of my education and appreciation that education isn't just academic. It is academia, right? It is math and science and history and other things, but it is also music and travel and food and games, and
Mm.
chess is education. And I think the game of chess saved my life because it gave me an opportunity to see the world differently.
Mm.
And I guess at the end of the action item, I'm telling a funny story about why I named my book the way they did. And I think that anytime we can do something that broadens our horizon, and if you don't have a hobby or a thing that's doing that, and you find yourself in too many circles of repeated affirmation versus new education information, I would
Mm.
say that that's an action item to reconsider, and listen to more podcasts, and to do things that challenge your own status quo, because I feel like if you're never losing when you're learning, as Eric likes to say, that is his coined phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that like learning and becoming exposed and being willing to be challenged about a previously held belief is probably like the most important muscle like you can develop as a human being.
Mm.
And the openness of that, of the process of there are things I don't know, and even if I don't have the time all the time to pursue it, I'm never going to forget that, because that kind of saved me in many ways. And so that is the action item. Not just play chess. I'm kidding. But yeah, but
But
just
also play chess.
expose yourself to things that you aren't currently doing. And anyway, so you put me on the spot, so I hope that was the best I could do.
That was fantastic.
Okay.
That was fantastic. Well, Danny Rensch, I mean, chess master, commentator, incredible author, and just extraordinary human. Thank you so much for being here. Listeners, get Dark Squares, How Chess Saved My Life by Danny Rensch. Available everywhere once it comes out, right, Danny?
Thank you for having me. This is the first conversation. I'm so grateful to have been able to do it with you. This felt very safe, and I really mean I hold on to the pillow. This has been tough, and I felt so grateful that you have the podcast you do, that you have the audience you do, and just that you would create a space for me to be able to share like this, because by the time this is out, there will probably be some other podcasts as well, but anyone listening to this will know that this was the first, and it means a lot to me to be able to be here. And so thank you.
Thank you. Such an honor for me, Danny.